Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Have you ever worked hard on a project, at school or at work, and were very proud of it? You felt good about what you had done. And then, someone else, a friend of yours even, shows up with a project that just totally blows yours out of the water. Makes you look like an amateur. You can't really be mad at them, they just did a good job, and a better job than you. You want to be mad at them maybe, but you admire what they created and hopefully will take a lesson from it to try and make something better next time. I mean, that's never happened to me. I'm spectacular in everything I ever do. However, on an entirely unrelated note, recently I've been re-listening to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. Currently, he's been covering the Russian Revolution, which is fascinating. I recommend a listen. But I decided to go back and listen to some older episodes. For example, I went back and listened to the first episode about the Central American revolutions. His introductory episode on that topic goes back to cover the entire history of the Spanish Empire in the New World in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes to cover something that took me, at best, 3 or 4 episodes, and that I still don't feel I have covered thoroughly enough. I bring this up because today we're going to be doing a bit of a refresher. And I wish that I could have done nearly as concise and thorough a job as Mike Duncan. But I haven't. But I want to talk about this anyway because it's been so long since we've talked about any of these characters. And we could go back and start this story at a number of different times and places. However, I'm choosing to do so in 1671 with Henry Morgan and the sack of Panama. Or rather, not the sack of Panama itself, but the large number of pirates and buccaneers and privateers that were all brought together under that one flag. This is episode 138, Flag of Defiance. The other aspect of the raid on Panama that's important is the Brethren of the Coast. That's the coalition of mostly French and English buccaneers that operated out of Tortuga in Haiti and Port Royal, Jamaica. They fought together on many of their biggest raids, including Panama, and continued to do so in the war that almost immediately followed the sack of Panama, called the Franco-Dutch War. The Franco-Dutch War pitted the Dutch and the Spanish on one side against the French and the English on the other. And those pirates who were not already in the West Indies at the sack of Panama got their start during the Franco-Dutch War. We see so many times people who would go on to be French and English pirates working together to attack mostly the Spanish but occasionally the Dutch. Now, the English and Dutch side of that conflict was much more centered in the East Indies, and some of our English characters got their start over there, not as privateers, but as Royal Navy men, some of them serving directly under James Stewart. Back in the West Indies, though, most of the fighting was between privateers, and more than anything, that was between the French and the Spanish. Most of the fighting was centered around the island of Hispaniola. Now, there were a bunch of Englishmen involved in that conflict, but most of them did so under French colors with a French commission. However, the English would lose that war, the third Anglo-Dutch arm of the Franco-Dutch War. They surrendered, and then, a couple of years later, came back, this time having switched sides. They were now allied with the Dutch against the French. Now, none of that's really important except for how that split affected the Brethren of the Coast. The French and English members of the Brethren of the Coast, who had been so close for many years now, all of a sudden had a rift between them. Where once they had been brothers, now they were enemies. Now, the Franco-Dutch conflict ended in the year 1678, and all of a sudden, the privateers were out of work. There was no raiding to be done, and that meant no profits. Many of the buccaneers turned to logwood poaching, or animal poaching, or just smuggling, which isn't great work or as profitable as privateering, but it's better than nothing. It's also better than, getting a job. But then we reach the year 1680 and into 1681. Now, two major events took place in those 2 years that are going to impact our story today. The first of these events looks innocuous. It looks small, hardly worth mentioning. But it involves a pirate who is going to be one of our key players moving forward. His name was Francois Grognet, and you may remember him. We've talked about him before, but for those who don't, I'm going to give a little background. Francois Grognet was a privateer in the Franco-Dutch War, but after the war ended, 2 years after the war ended, in the year 1681, Francois Grognet's ship was captured by the Spanish. His ship was commandeered, and Grognet and the rest of his crew were forced into labor on Spanish vessels. As far as we know, here in 1681, Grognet was a retired privateer, but not an active pirate. That makes the seizure of his vessel legally gray. It may have been legal in the eyes of the Spanish, but it was certainly illegal in the eyes of the French. Now Grognet escaped his captivity, along with some of his men, and returned back to Tortuga. There he received a letter of marque from the governor, a man named Jacques Nepveu, Sieur de Ponquet, another name you may remember. Letters of marque, or letters of reprisal, were intended for situations exactly like this. If a Spanish commander took your vessel, you could steal as much as necessary to reclaim the worth of that vessel and its cargo from any Spanish commander. This was an old tradition, but in those post-war years it was a rare thing. You had to have a pretty strong legitimate claim to receive one, and that made Francois Grognet immediately a popular commander. Naturally, all of those who had escaped with Francois Grognet were members of his crew, but there were a lot of empty spaces there as well. And those spots were filled almost immediately by some of the best buccaneers that Tortuga had to offer. They were introduced to Francois Grognet by the godfather of French buccaneer, Michel de Grumont. He supplied not only the men, but also a ship and the supplies necessary. This voyage of reprisal was quickly turning into the most talented and well-supplied pirate raid in years. Within just a few months, the privateer Francois Grognet grew a reputation to be one of the finest raiders in all of the West Indies. He reclaimed the lost wealth in short order, taking both ships and treasure from the Spanish. But then, he continued his raiding. Once he was back out there, he couldn't just leave it behind. However, as David F. Marley writes in his book Pirates of the Americas, quote, "While prowling off the island of Trinidad in January 1682, Grognet was intercepted by the flibuster commander Charles, Marquis de Maintenon, who was under orders from the French crown to curb piratical activity and restore stolen property." End quote. European politics are at play here. England, who had been allied to Spain and France and the Netherlands, all at different times during the war, had an inroad to all of those nations, and they were leading a coalition to keep the peace. The campaign to eradicate piracy, especially in the West Indies, was a major factor in that, and it was a sticking point for Spain. Both France and England were working hard to get rid of the pirates. Charles II of England would go on to pass that draconian anti-piracy writ in 1683, and Louis XIV of France was doing stuff like this. He had men specifically out to curb piracy, to arrest pirates and return any stolen property. Now, Francois Grognet was arrested, but he wasn't tried or executed. He was taken back to Tortuga, and he swore to stay on the right side of the law. In the meantime, in 1680 and into 1681, we have the first Pacific adventure. If you have ever listened to this show, you know what that is. The first Pacific adventure was a famous cruise, of which William Dampier and Lionel Wafer and Basil Ringrose all wrote accounts. The admiral, John Coxon, took all of the crews overland and into the Pacific Ocean. However, when the majority of the fleet voted to attack Panama, John Coxon and his crew decided to return home. Eventually, Bartholomew Sharp would take command of the fleet, but he proved to be a poor replacement for John Coxon. Sharp led the fleet to disaster after disaster and was eventually abandoned by almost a third of his pirates. That group, those who abandoned Sharp, included William Dampier, Lionel Wafer, Peter Harris, and the team of John Cook and Edward Davis. They, and a few dozen other men, headed back north and crossed into the Caribbean. Upon their return to the West Indies, those pirates had a bit of drama with the Tortuga buccaneers. They were picked up on the north coast of Panama by a group of French pirates. This looked a lot like rescue, but those same pirates betrayed them. The French tried to sell them out to Governor Poncet. However, Edward Davis led a bold escape in that and rescued John Cook and all the rest of the Englishmen. But that right there is an example of the rift we mentioned. In the end, though, William Dampier made it to Virginia, Cook and Davis made it over to the Mosquito Coast, and Lionel Wafer made it to North Africa. The rest of the fleet, still in the Pacific under Captain Sharp, that included Basil Ringrose, and they traveled south to round Cape Horn and eventually returned to England, where they were arrested. They faced trial, but in the end they were set free. They were set free in large part because, well, that's an interesting question. Basil Ringrose had extensive documentation of his journey that proved of great interest to the crowns of both England and Scotland, who, we might remember, was the same guy at the time. Sharp, the one-time admiral, had plenty of experience navigating those coasts. Both the experience of Sharp and Ringrose and all of their men might just prove invaluable should the British decide to, capture a little Pacific territory from the Spanish. However, after they all returned home, piracy died down a bit. For another 2 years it was quiet in the West Indies, until about 1683. And that brings us back to Francois Grognet. Grognet, after officially swearing to stay on the right side of the law, immediately broke that oath. He left Tortuga for St. Croix, where he took a license from the governor there to raid the Spanish. Now, Grognet had some brilliant successes in that venture, but he received word from Lauro de Graaf to return to Tortuga, not for punishment, but for an opportunity. De Graaf had a major raid planned in Venezuela, and they were gathering all of their men and munitions and ships and supplies. Now, this wasn't a pirate raid. This was a military matter, and they had a military commander along for the ride. His name was Major Jean Le Goff. During the voyage, one of the buccaneers was insubordinate to the major, and Jean Le Goff had him whipped. This is incredibly stupid when dealing with a crew of buccaneers. Of course, it led to a mutiny. The whole operation fell apart barely after leaving port, and the pirates returned to Tortuga. Francois Grognet, especially, was a bit incensed. He had been doing well on his own, and he returned to Tortuga for this. However, that godfather of the Tortuga buccaneers, Michel de Grammont, informed him of a gathering. He told Grognet that a bunch of buccaneers would be arriving at Tortuga del Mar, an island off the coast of Venezuela, to go ahead and undertake that original invasion just without the army involved. But this wasn't the sort of thing that we could mention to the governor. Understand? This is the kind of meeting to keep secret. This was going to be an old-fashioned kind of raid, if you take my meaning. Now, this all happened in the summer of 1684, and that was a particularly busy time when it came to clandestine pirate meetings. They seem to have been happening everywhere that summer, and all of them were pointed south. While Grognet was talking to Grammont, or just before, another meeting was taking place among pirates. Somewhere. We don't know where it took place exactly, as it was a secret meeting, but more than likely it was on the Mosquito Coast, even perhaps Abraham's Key. I feel fairly comfortable in making that assumption because of the flurry of activity that emanates from around that region in the English buccaneering community. 2 pirates named John Eaton and Francis Townley were spotted separately in Port Royal, just having a few quiet drinks, certainly not recruiting scalawags for any missions upcoming. The Port Royal authorities took note of this and realized that something might be up, but they had no evidence to arrest them at the time. Another ship, the pirate ship Revenge, under John Cook and Edward Davis, was spotted far from Port Royal, in New York City. Coincidentally, that's where Lionel Wafer happened to be and writing his book. We can be 100% absolutely certain that John Cook and Edward Davis did not take any bribes from the governor there because, as we all know, colonial governors were upstanding citizens. They would never pay pirates to undertake secret, illegal missions to regions that they themselves had a financial interest in. That's not the sort of thing governors did, because governors had agents to do it for them. Shortly after leaving New York, with or without fat sacks of silver, the Revenge stopped by the Virginia colony to collect William Dampier and his 20 or so friends there. In England, there were less clandestine meetings taking place, although I suspect those too were spurred by more clandestine meetings. A prominent London trading firm was outfitting a ship called Signet for a voyage to the Southern Ocean, specifically to Peru, where Signet and her captain, the former buccaneer Charles Swan, were to trade with the Spanish. Now Swan met with both Bartholomew Sharp and Basil Ringrose to discuss the region with which they were so familiar. Ringrose, who was pretty much broke by 1683, he decided to go with Charles Swan to come along as his navigator. Now, as this summer of 1684 faded into fall, all of those plans were in motion. Captain John Eaton, aboard the 250-ton Nicholas, was sailing south around Brazil and toward the Cape, where he could enter the Pacific. Captain Charles Swan of the Signet was leaving England for Africa, where he would cross the Atlantic, round the Cape, and enter the Pacific. John Cook and Edward Davis, sailing from North America, were taking a similar route. There in the region known as Guinea, in Africa, John Cook and Edward Davis made a stop to capture a ship. They were pirates, it's what they do. But they found a particularly rich prize, a slave ship that would go on to become one of the most infamous ships in all of pirate mythology. The name of that ship was Bachelor's Delight. However, where that name comes from is up for debate. It might be a simple and innocuous name. These were free men on the high seas. They were roaming bachelors living the life that they chose. Bachelor's Delight. Or the name might be insidious. That Dutch slave ship that they captured was already full of slaves. They were already in chains, and many of those slaves were women. Now, a few weeks later, the pirates did, we know, drop off all of the slaves near a maroon camp on the coast of South America. But some do believe that the women on board provided the entertainment during the Atlantic crossing, and thus they believe that is the origination of the name Bachelor's Delight. Now, I don't subscribe to that belief, but it is worth a mention nonetheless. The crew of Bachelor's Delight, though, is important to our story moving forward. Aside from John Cook and Edward Davis, there was William Dampier, of course, and we've talked about him and his activities after this cruise at length. But there are others that we need to mention. Ambrose Crowley, for example, who we will be talking more about in the future, and another crewman by the name of John Reed. Yes, the very same who we've talked about so much recently. After rounding Cape Horn, on their way to the Juan Fernandez Islands, Bachelor's Delight, Nicholas, and Signet all met up in the South Pacific. This fleet we might consider, say, the Southern Squadron of what would become the Second Pacific Adventure. Now, Signet's plans to trade in Peru were pretty quickly dashed when John Eaton sailed off to attack Spanish ships in the region. His raids alerted all of the Spaniards that there were pirates out there and made legitimate trade with the Spanish absolutely impossible. Without any income coming in and with a pretty serious need for protection, Charles Swan agreed to join forces with Bachelor's Delight and the Nicholas. Meanwhile, to the north, back in the West Indies, Francois Grognet arrived at Tortuga del Mar, just off the coast of Venezuela. He had 190 Frenchmen with him and somewhere in the realm of 60 or 70 Englishmen. Now, this was a large group of pirates, but they were all there for that super-secret meeting organized by Michel de Grammont. Let's return for a second to that rift between the French and the English. They weren't open enemies. They didn't blast each other out of the water on sight or anything like that. Despite even the betrayal of Cook and Davis by the French, they were still openly friendly. But they had a very serious rivalry there. Look at Grognet's fleet makeup here. There were a number of other captains under the commander. The French pirates Pierre Le Picard, Mathurin de Marté, and Jean Lescouillet were the three most prominent. Grognet, Picard, de Marté, and Lescouillet were all breakaways from Tortuga and the overbearing character of Lauro de Graaf. That Dutchman and his lot were becoming more and more legitimate by the day. They were turning into good king's privateers, and these buccaneers wanted none of that. I should also mention one other crewman, a man named Ravenot de Lussan. He's going to be keeping a journal, which we will be using moving forward. That's a lot of French commanders and French pirates, but there were those Englishmen there as well. Peter Harris, the nephew of the Peter Harris from the first Pacific adventure, and William Knight were the two most prominent captains among them, but I also want to point out a regular crewman who was there named George Dew. That's a name you might want to remember. Think about the disparity in power there. There were a ton of French pirates and a few English pirates, and that disparity would only widen with the arrival of Michel de Grammont and all of his Frenchmen. This was by design. The English pirates were welcome, certainly, more guns, more hands, but this was a French fleet under French command. Unfortunately, Michel de Grammont failed to appear. After waiting around for a few weeks, what turned out to be a few weeks too long, Francois Grognet made the decision to sail west from Tortuga del Mar to a place called the Golden Isle on the coast of Panama. It was, reportedly, the meeting place for a bunch of other pirates under the Englishman Francis Townley, who we last saw in Jamaica. Now, they were all English pirates, and that would unfortunately shift the balance of power among the fleet, probably to become more or less equal, or even potentially to tip it over to English control. For Francois Grognet, that was less than ideal, but still better than sailing alone, or, worse yet, coming home empty-handed again. But when they arrived at the Golden Isle, Townley was already gone. He had taken his fleet and sailed for Darien. Grognet chose to follow Townley's fleet, which is risky. Following in the wake of another pirate, a pirate who was liable to make some mischief along the way, was dangerous. However, if Grognet moved quick, maybe they could catch him up. In the meantime, the Southern Pacific contingent, Signet and Nicholas and Bachelor's Delight, was currently operating in Peru. They made enough trouble that the governor at Lima sent out a fleet to hunt them down. So the pirates fled north to the Captaincy General of Bogota, which was, by 1684, virtually an independent state. Again, they made enough trouble that the Captaincy General sent out a fleet to hunt them down. The pirates fled west into what is essentially a no-man's land between the two viceroyalties. That no-man's land was situated between the audiencias of Panama and Bogota. And again, if you have ever listened to this show, you know about the country called Darien. It was swampy and mountainous and infested with alligators and mosquitoes, but it was dangerous to the Spanish more than any other reason, because of the Guna people. They made Darien their home and used it to fight a guerrilla war against the Spanish on both sides. To further that war, the Guna often hosted pirates, really Any enemies of Spain were welcome, but pirates were usually those who showed up. For example, when Francis Townley crossed the isthmus, they played a major role in the first Pacific adventure. Just a few weeks earlier, when Francis Townley crossed the isthmus, the Guna gave him guides and aid. And at just this moment, just about the time that the English were running from the fleet out of Bogota, Francois Grognet and his men were marching south, aided by the Guna. Now those French buccaneers arrived at the Gulf of San Miguel, which is an entrance into Panama Bay, and beyond that, into the Pacific Ocean. The Guna were kind enough to give them canoes, but that's all they had. They'd left all their ships on the other side of Panama. Now they undertook a series of canoe-bound raids against small Spanish vessels. Their most noteworthy capture was a half-galley, which was better than nothing, but beyond that all they had were a few fishing boats and the best of the Guna canoes. The Bachelor's Delight, under Cook and Davis, was sailing all alone. John Eaton had recently left their little flotilla, heading west, hoping to catch up with Francis Townley. Signet was sailing for Panama, hoping to beat John Eaton to the region so that he could trade before the other pirates started causing trouble. Ravenot de Lussan tells us that Grognet and Lescouillet stopped at an island out in the Bay of Panama. And then he writes, quote, 2 leagues from whence they discerned a ship on fire. End quote. They went to that island to retreat from whatever was happening there. They would be a good place to hide from any Spaniards who were involved in whatever fighting was going on the horizon. Under different circumstances, they would probably have sailed in to scoop up the spoils of 2 weary and wounded Spanish vessels. But all they had were canoes and fishing boats and that half-galley, and that just wasn't enough to take advantage of the situation. What they really needed was a bark or even a brigantine. If they were amazingly lucky, a frigate, but that was impossible. All 3 were impossible without a decent pirate ship or cannons to work with. A few leagues to the east, on the horizon from the Pearl Islands, a proper pirate ship that was brimming with cannons was capturing the Spanish frigate Santa Rosa. That was Bachelor's Delight involved in that fighting, and she captured that Spanish vessel. After the battle, the English pirates made the same decision as the French, to head off to that secluded island chain. Lussan says, quote, by break of day we saw the English under sail, end quote. When they did eventually meet up, they had a lot to discuss. I do imagine it was a bit tense, taking into account that rift between the English and French. However, all of the pirates were willing to put any of that aside in favor of the enemy they all shared, the Spanish. And each of the 2 parties had something of use to offer to the other. The English had the recently captured ship Santa Rosa, a frigate that was in excellent condition, barring a little bit of damage from the recent battle, but that had guns and tools and victuals and everything else that the French buccaneers would need to become a real pirate terror in the Pacific. Honestly, it was probably the best ship that the English had, including Nicholas and Bachelor's Delight and Signet. The English might have taken it for their own. Had John Eaton still been around, they may have done so. But the Santa Rosa was a bit too large for just the crew of Bachelor's Delight. Beyond that, they'd put a lot of work into Bachelor's Delight, making her a proper pirate vessel. And the Santa Rosa was just the right size to hold almost all the French buccaneers. So Cook and Davis handed Santa Rosa over to their friends with what I can only assume must have been a slight twinge of remorse. And then the French had their own gifts for their English friends. Francois Grognet had letters of marque, signed by Jacques Nepveux, that allowed the bearer of that letter of marque to engage in absolutely legal privateering against the Spanish. So what's more valuable here? When we consider that it was at this moment illegal for the English to even accept those letters of marque from a foreign prince, and take into account that Governor Jacques Nepveu had recently been fired and arrested and replaced, well, as a legal shield, those letters of marque were pretty flimsy. They wouldn't stop the English pirates from swinging at the end of a rope, be it an English or Spanish or French rope. Personally, I'd take the ship. And that's exactly what the French did. They climbed aboard their new ship, they gave her the once-over with their carpenters and gunners, and then they set about their business. First, they held an election, but that went as expected. Francois Grognet was installed as captain of Santa Rosa, with Jean Lescouillet, Pierre Le Picard, Pierre Blot, who we have not yet mentioned, and Mathurin de Marté serving as his officers. Ravenet de Lussan continued his journal-keeping. Much like Dampier has been, Lussan is going to be a central character from here on out, because, more than any other reason, he was writing down his experiences. For example, shortly after setting out from Taboga, he tells us, quote, "On the 25th of April, we took an advice boat going to Peru that was carrying packets from Madrid and letters from the Viceroy of Lima, wherein there was an account of how many men of war, fire ships, and merchantmen the fleet consisted of, and about what time the same might arrive at Panama." End quote. Which is to say, an account of a fleet that the pirates needed to avoid. According to Lussan, the captain of that advice boat carried a chest of jewels on board, from Panama, bound to the Viceroy at Lima. Unfortunately, he had orders, should pirates arrive, to toss that overboard, which he did. He even taunted the pirates about it. And then Lussan tells us of putting the question to the captain, and then the ship's master. Now, he does neglect to mention the torture that was almost certainly involved, but it is implied. And isn't this just kind of wonderful? I love the account of Ravenet de Lussan. It's got everything I want. You know, Dampier just kind of has this habit of talking about penguins and wind patterns for all the world like he's just some erstwhile scientist, while his buddies are in the background sword fighting and capturing ships, daring do's going on, and he says nothing about it. But Lussan, he knows how to get to the good stuff. He writes, quote, "On the 27th we departed with 500 men to go and take La Cepa, which is a small town 7 leagues to the windward of Panama. About 10 in the morning we discovered 2 pirogues bearing upon us. We presently sent out 2 of our best sailing canoes, manned with 20 men each, to attack them. These quickly took us to be what we really were, i.e., freebooters, made no delay to save themselves upon one of the islands in the Bay of Panama. They got upon a rising ground, with their arms and as much ammunition as they could save, and fought stiffly against us, we marching under a flag of defiance." End quote. It's hard to say what Lussan means by flag of defiance here. First of all, it could be a mistranslation, and he could be talking about the flag of the enemy. If it was in fact a flag of defiance for the pirates, it could be the traditional French standard of a white cross on a blue field. Or it could be the gold fleur-de-lis on a blue field. Probably not that one, but it's possible. Or it could be the English Red Cross on a white field. All 3, when doing battle against the Spanish, might have been seen as a flag of defiance. However, I choose to believe that in preparing Santa Rosa for her voyage, they prepared several Jolly Roger. Now, probably not the skull and crossbones here, not back in 1685, but a black flag would have signified death, or even a red flag that signified blood. Both would have been instantly recognizable to anyone as a pirate standard, especially to the Spanish, though. The black flag would ring of Barbary pirates, like those under Barbarossa, and the red would remind them of the Sallee rovers, also from North Africa, who flew the Sallee Rouge. Whatever flag it was, under it the pirates defeated this small Spanish militia, took their boats, and burned them. I really wanted today's story to end where we left off with these pirates so many months ago. But unfortunately, we're going to end there today. There's too much still to cover. However, as I said, I really enjoy the way that Raveneau de Lussan tells his story. Moving on, he's really going to get to the point and do the good stuff. Next time, we're going to follow these pirates through some of that good stuff under their flag of defiance, and then we're going to begin their journey home to the West Indies. Last time, we left off with the second Pacific Adventure pirates in the Bay of Panama on board 2 ships. Bachelor's Delight carried William Dampier as pilot, Edward Davis as quartermaster, and John Cook as captain. The recently captured Spanish frigate Santa Rosa carried Pierre Le Picard, Pierre Blot, Mathurin de Marté, Raveneau de Lussan, and Francois Grognet as captain. Today we're going to bring their story up to date with where we left off so many months ago. This is episode 139, The New Corsairs. When those 2 groups of pirates met up, they split along national lines. The English Corsairs, who had been sailing with Grognet, went over to John Cook and Bachelor's Delight, namely Peter Harris and William Knight. However, George Dew stuck with the French buccaneers. That split along national lines did have something to do with the tensions among the brethren and the ancient enmity between the English and the French, but it was also a practical decision. The English had room on board Bachelor's Delight and a bark in tow they could fill up. Santa Rosa, well, a big ship with a half-galley, was filled nearly to capacity with the French. Once the crews were organized and they voted in their officers, the pirates spent a few weeks working on their vessels. Bachelor's Delight was careened and cleaned, but the carpenters got to work on Santa Rosa, turning her into a proper pirate ship. While the pirates were working on their vessels, though, they sent their bark and their half-galley back to the Gulf of San Miguel on the southern coast of modern Panama. There were yet more pirates on their way across the isthmus. Remember the flurry of pirate meetings that took place the previous summer? These were just waves of pirates headed to the Pacific. Anyone who wanted to raid the Spanish was here at this moment. The newly arrived pirates were commanded by Jean Rose, a long-time French buccaneer, but once they got to the Pacific, the pirates under Jean Rose split between him and de Marté and William Knight. While cruising the Gulf of San Miguel, that little fleet captured a Spanish sloop of war, likely a Coast Guard ship, and Jean Rose was given command of her. Once the entire fleet was assembled, they were 5 ships strong. Bachelor's Delight under Cook and Davis, Saint Rose under Grognet, a half-galley under Jean Lescouillet, a bark under William Knight, and that sloop under Jean Rose. The first mission they intended to undertake was a rescue mission, after a fashion. But it was also a raid on the richest prize in the Western Hemisphere, the Silver Fleet from Lima, bound for Panama. That same fleet of which they had word from that advice boat we talked about last time. A fleet that included not only merchantmen carrying treasure, but many men of war, fire ships, and even a few gunboats. A month ago, that would have been an unthinkable prize, but now they had a chance. And while I say that it was an unthinkable prize, that's not really the case. It would have been an impossible prize, but it was definitely thinkable. That's why they were here in the first place. That's the reason that Cook and Davis took the long way around, why they captured an excellent Dutch slave vessel to turn into a pirate ship. They wanted a good ship there in the Pacific with which they could capture other good ships. Other ships that could be turned into proper pirate vessels for the pirates who came overland. That was the plan. However, I mentioned a rescue mission. John Eaton and Francis Townley were also in the Pacific, but not with this fleet we just talked about. They were out near Panama raising hell and raising alarms. Charles Swan in the Signet was also near Panama, preparing to waltz in and ask to trade, but he didn't know about John Eaton and Francis Townley causing that trouble. He didn't know that the Panamanians, upon his arrival, would almost certainly arrest him and hang his crew. Cook and Davis and Grognet and Jean Rose and Lescuyer and that whole fleet, they needed to get to Captain Swan to rescue him. But then, with their 5 ships and 1,000 pirates, they could blockade Panama. They could build a web into which the treasure fleet would fall, and they could capture her. This should have been the moment, the crowning achievement of the buccaneers, the moment when a fleet of pirates accomplished the dream of, well, every sea rover to ever sail the West Indies. From Francis Drake to Henry Morgan to pirates who haven't even been born yet, they were going to capture the treasure fleet. They were going to make themselves the masters of Panama and return home the richest and most famous pirates in history. So why, as they were so prepared and so motivated, why don't most people know the names of these pirates? Why aren't they as famous as Morgan or Blackbeard? Well, they failed. They really could have done it, if not for 2 major problems. First of all, there was the division between the English and the French. The fleet could not agree on a single commander. Grognet was in command of the flibustier French, but Cook, on the other hand, had the English under him. Now, they agreed to work together, but they would be 2 separate fleets under 2 separate commanders. This is never a good idea. When the French revolutionary government, well over a century later, offered, or perhaps threatened, to send out another general to share command with the young and relatively new Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon refused. Napoleon said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that 1 bad general would be better than 2 good generals. It's a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, and that's what the pirates out of Panama had here. 2 fleets with 2 commanders with their own goals and agendas and priorities. They agreed to work together, but even then, that took time for them to discuss and make decisions. And it was a fatal flaw. But the other fatal flaw in this fleet of pirates is that it was made up of pirates. I mean, they had the ships, they had the guns, and they had the numbers. They also had, perhaps the most important thing, the pirates had the cunning to get a fleet like this to Panama in the first place. That's something that the Royal Navy could never pull off. The Navy would attempt to sail the fleet in boldly and alert the Spanish of their presence months ahead of time. But what the pirates didn't have, and what the Royal Navy had in spades, was discipline. The pirates needed discipline were they to win a fight like this. They blockaded the port of Panama. But then, as they waited for the treasure fleet to arrive, they sort of just sat around for a while. Grognet was writing letters to the governor of Panama, who was writing letters back, but it looked a lot like nothing was getting done. But that's when Francis Townley and John Eaton, who had been cruising to the west, showed up to ruin everything. Now, this is all very 80s high school movie, but Townley and Eaton appeared to make fun of Grognet. He was just sitting around wasting time while they were over there being proper pirates. They're like the bullies in an old movie. What are you doing, bro? Writing letters to the governor? Don't be lame. Then they smashed a can of natty against their head, kicked sand in your face, and walked away with half your pirates. I mean, we've all been there, right? At least we've all seen that movie. But Townley and Eaton did show up to abscond with 500 pirates in the fleet. Now, it's improper to say that they stole the pirates from Captain Grognet. Pirates were free to make their own decisions, and if Townley and Eaton had an idea that they found attractive, they were allowed to go with him. However, they were seduced away from the fleet and the plan. They were seduced away to go ashore and raid a village, a small village to the east of Panama. And sure, they got to rape a few village girls and found a cache of wine, and they even found a church to ransack with a minuscule amount of tithes inside, But wouldn't you know it, right when they decided to go ashore and sate their mini-thirsts, that's when the Peruvian treasure fleet arrived on the scene. I, personally, think that the Spanish commander was waiting for this very moment. I think he outplayed the pirates, because he knew that pirates were many things, but patient was not one of them. However, as to the first problem, splitting the command between Cook and Grognet, they had no good method of communication. The fleet was spread out there in the bay. The English comprised the farthest reaches of their spiderweb. They were far from shore, while the French were very close to shore. Except now, close to shore, most of the crewmen were not on those French ships. The only ships in the fleet that were not criminally undermanned at this point were Signet and Bachelor's Delight and the bark of William Knight. Now they moved in to intercept the Peruvian treasure fleet, but they were far away. The French ships who should have been able to delay the treasure fleet, Saint Rose in particular, was unable to budge. The fleet just slipped by the pirates and made it safely to the harbor of Panama. Now, once the treasure ships were safely in Panama Harbor and under the guard of the big guns on the fort there, the rest of the Spanish fleet, the warships, the barks and fireships and gunboats, they turned around. They began to make their way toward the pirates. Now, Bachelor's Delight and the other English vessels still didn't realize the Saint Rose was undermanned. They didn't know what was happening. They turned to flee. They thought, I think, that it might have been a French betrayal. I mean, what was going on here? But then they heard the pleas of the French from over the water. Cook and Davis realized that their crew was not on board. They were raiding ashore. Now, Saint Rose could get under sail, but they needed time. They would only be able to escape if the English could buy them that time. So, despite whatever enmity may have been there, Charles Swan and John Cook and Edward Davis and William Knight and all the rest turned around to face the incoming Spanish. Now, this was not a ship-of-the-line style battle. It was a long-distance running battle. The English kept their distance from the Spanish. They took the occasional pot shot whenever the opportunity presented itself, but mostly they did their best to lead the Spanish away from Saint Rose. When the English saw that Saint Rose and the French were finally moving under full sail, the entire fleet turned and ran. Townley and Eaton and the 500 French pirates who had gone ashore were able to escape as well, but by the skin of their teeth. In the aftermath of this disaster, recriminations flew back and forth. Cook and Davis were angry that Grognet had let his men go ashore. Townley and Eaton were angry that Grognet had let them take the men ashore for such meager pickings when the Peruvian treasure fleet was out there. And the men who abandoned Grognet were angry at Grognet that he let them go to get such meager pickings ashore when the treasure fleet was out there. Suffice it to say, Grognet caught the worst of it, and I think unfairly. Everyone appeared to be mad at him, and he had failed in his command, but I would be more upset with the men who, abandoned the plan. But the fleet fell apart. The English contingent, Signet, Bachelor's Delight, Nicholas, and the ship of Francis Townley all went off on their own, to the west. But then on 9th July, 1685, the French fleet split up as well. They voted to replace Captain Grognet and vote in Pierre Le Picard, who also sailed west in Saint Rose. Now Jean Lescouillet, the vice-admiral of the fleet, who might have been voted in instead, was killed in the fighting there at Panama. So his men went mostly with Picard, but a few did go over to John Cook. William Knight, frustrated by their failure, elected to sail south and make his way around Tierra del Fuego to return home. That left Grognet and Jean Rose. Jean Rose had his sloop of war, while Grognet had a smaller sloop and a few boats, and only 50 men left to him. For a time, Jean Rose attempted to bolster Grognet's spirits, but Grognet despaired, and Jean Rose left to follow after Saint-Rose and the English. Now most of those other pirates met up in the Gulf of Nicoya: Signet, Bachelor's Delight, Saint-Rose, Jean Rose, and Captain Eden. They raided mostly separately because they were smaller raids, plantations and coastal towns, nothing to write home about. However, they did have men to write about it. There was a flurry of piratical activity, but it got a little hot. Francis Townley and Peter Harris sailed back east to meet up with Francois Grognet. Notably, the crewman George Dew, aboard Townley's vessel, and most of the old crew of Jean Lescouillet went with them. Now, the fleet, after meeting up with Grognet, was a much more traditional pirate fleet. It was made up of sloops and barks rather than frigates. They didn't really have an admiral, instead a coalition of separate pirate vessels working together. It was the democratic ideal of small underdog pirate ships taking on larger and more powerful imperial Spanish vessels. However, there were no men there to write down their exploits. Spanish officials did record some of their prizes, which were nothing too impressive, but we know nothing of their day-to-day life. However, in these months where pirates were at the Gulf of Nicoya, there were a flurry of deaths and reshuffling of crews. First, Captain Eden, who had been in the Gulf of Nicoya with the writer Ambrose Cowley aboard, left the Western Hemisphere entirely. He did so to cross the Pacific and get to Asia a few months before Signet would follow with Dampier and that lot aboard. There in the Gulf of Nicoya, or rather on the coast of Nicaragua, John Cook died, probably of dysentery. He was replaced as captain of Bachelor's Delight by Edward Davis. Davis and everyone who was left there in the Gulf of Nicoya went east. Ostensibly they were going to follow William Knight to round the Cape and return home. However, to the east, that other fleet of smaller pirate vessels had seen some changes as well. Captain Townley died in battle, and he was replaced by his very popular quartermaster, George Dew. Now, we need to talk a bit about George Dew, and this is as good a place as any to introduce him. George Dew was probably English by birth. He might have been French, though, or more probably, I think, he was born in the Americas, Port Royal or Tortuga, or maybe one of the Windward colonies. Regardless of to which empire he was a subject, George Dew was not a loyal citizen of any European power. He spoke French and English and probably a good bit of Dutch, and don't think that that's because of his time at finishing school. George Dew was a provincial. He grew up in the colonies and probably grew up around pirates. I mean, even his name, George Dew, might not exactly be accurate. That's what English court records have down, but French records give him a different name, Georges Dew. Now I realize that that does sound kind of like I just said George Dew with a French accent, which is basically what's happening here. But in this case, there's a spelling difference that marks it out. Instead of D-E-W for George Dew, it's Georges D''Hou. That's what Ravenel de Lussan calls him in his original French manuscript. That's what French court records call him. But whether it's George Dew or Georges Dew, regardless of his background, Dew always appears to have been a citizen of the world more than a citizen of an empire. The first word we have of him officially is on board a pirate ship in the West Indies that took a letter of marque and turned privateer during the war. But to my eyes, George Dew is a new breed. He's not an Englishman trying to make it in the New World. He's not a Frenchman running from oppression in Ancien Regime France. No, he's an American pirate. He may have officially been a subject of England or France, but he had no home in England or France. His loyalty was to his comrades and, of course, to his own purse. George Dew has no agenda, at least no agenda that I can discern, because none of those political or religious struggles that defined so many of the pirates had anything to do with George Dew. He's just a West Indian native who made his living raiding the Spanish and made good. However, when George Dew really makes good, he wasn't raiding the Spanish at all. Instead, he was raiding Mughal and Ottoman shipping. But that's for later on. Here we see George Dew, though, on the Second Pacific Adventure in his first captaincy. Dew appears to have been in a sort of command role over Peter Harris and even Francois Grognet. His ship and his crew were the biggest in the fleet, and I hesitate to make this comparison, but it sticks out at me. It's my second Napoleon reference today, and I am rereading Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts. But in his first command of an entire army, Napoleon was placed above a bunch of other generals who had served France for decades. Now, in part, that's because the older generals had served the monarchy, while Napoleon's revolutionary credentials were pretty spotless. But Napoleon proved to be Napoleon. He was obviously amazing. He won all of the generals over, and that's kind of what happened here with Peter Harris and even Francois Grognet in regard to George Dew. He did an excellent job, and they fell in behind him and all enjoyed some success. But then, the real pirates showed up. Sailors who had credentials that overawed anything that George Dew had to offer. Saint Rose and Jean Rose arrived on the scene. Now, Jean Rose was a well-known and respected pirate. He had a ton of prizes and victories under his belt, and more than likely, Dew would have fallen in behind him. However, the captain of Saint Rose, Pierre Le Picard, was a real old sea dog. He was a legend in the world of the buccaneers. If this was the same Pierre Le Picard that sailed alongside Henry Morgan, and here I am choosing to believe that he would have been at every major pirate event in the West Indies since 1665. And I wonder, if this were the same Pierre Le Picard, I wonder if he and Charles Swan, another privateer under Henry Morgan, I wonder if they ever reminisced about their time with Morgan. I wonder if they ever sat the men down and regaled them with tales of their victory at Panama, perhaps to get them invested in the fight for Panama. I imagine them all sitting around on deck of an evening, with Charles Swan and Pierre Le Picard in the center, perhaps sitting on barrels. I imagine cigar smoke rising above their heads and everyone passing around the wine. I imagine those two talking about the march across Panama. They didn't have any Guna guides in those days. All they had were hostile Indian ambushes. I imagine them talking about the hillside camp just outside of Panama, of their fires that lit up like the night sky, and the river of blood from slaughtered cattle that flooded down the hill to Panama's streets. And of course, they would have talked about Morgan and their victory over a Spanish army. Whether or not that took place, Pierre Le Picard was immediately and unquestionably in command of the whole fleet once they came together. Now, they might have had a similar conflict of interest had Bachelor's Delight and Edward Davis been there as well. But at the moment, Edward Davis was down at the Juan Fernandez Islands careening his vessel. However, he was heading north very shortly, as fast as possible. Because the fleet was coming together not just out of happenstance, but because of a plan. A plan that apparently was concocted by George Dew. That plan wasn't new. It had been attempted and failed at least 3 times before. Twice on the first Pacific adventure, killing their second admiral, and once earlier on this voyage. The plan was to attack Guayaquil. Now, we don't need to go into any real depth covering the 1687 raid on Guayaquil. We covered it in great detail back in episodes 70 and 71. In short, the fleet landed at Point St. Helena, which was an outcrop of land near the city of Guayaquil. They split up into 3 units. The vanguard, out front, was led by Francois Grognet. They would attack the city first. Pierre Le Picard led the majority of the troops in the main body of the army, and serving as a sort of shock troop contingent was George Dew and his elite crew. The battle went well. Francois Grognet, with around 100 troops, attacked the city and drew their attention and fire when, from the west, Pierre Le Picard came in, stormed the barricades, and made his way into town. George Dew even had his moment of glory when the cavalry came out to attack the pirate forces, and he attacked them from the rear. They landed at Point St. Helena on the 5th of April, 1687, and did not leave Guayaquil until the end of May. They occupied the city for over a month, and there were excesses and even atrocities. There was looting and there was murder, but there was also torture and rape. Ravenel de Lussan tries to brush all that aside, of course. He tells us that once the people of Guayaquil realized that the pirates were not demons come to eat their babies, the women grew very familiar, which we all know is nonsense. He even tells us that one widow, whose husband had been killed in the pirate attack only a few days before, fell deeply in love with him and offered to marry him and give him her husband's former office and a fine dowry, and it's all just not true. But it does make for good, exciting, romantic, high-seas adventure storytelling. If you don't remember much about the raid on Guayaquil, it is interesting, and you should go back and listen to those episodes. In part because, well, it marks kind of an end to this story. First of all, after they finally left Guayaquil, the pirates had to leave the region. Not just that region of coastline, but the Pacific in general. I mean, after you attack a city like Guayaquil, you don't just hang around for the hammer to drop. The cavalry was coming. Plus, the pirates after Guayaquil had a ton of treasure. They needed to get back home. They had to spend it, after all, and Ravenel de Lussan tells us he was lucky. He was able to convert most of his treasure to silver and gold, so it was relatively light, but other pirates had so much that it weighed them down and they had to drop off the heaviest of it. However, Guayaquil, as the end of a chapter, does mark the death of one of my favorite pirates in this entire story. Francois Grognet was killed in action and buried at sea. Grognet was central to this story. He was not only a leader, but he was a key figure in holding together the peace between the French and English buccaneers. His death was a blow to that peace. However, in some ways, George Dew would replace him in that role, but there was one major hitch to that. George Dew did not like the Tortuga buccaneers, Lauro de Graaf and his group. We might say that George Dew hated them, and the feeling was mutual, perhaps even with interest. And that mutual dislike would inform a lot of future events and lead to, well, spoilers. But keep that in the back of your mind. After Guayaquil, the fleet split up once again. Bachelor's Delight, under Captain Edward Davis, sailed south to round the Cape, as was his original plan. Nearly the rest of the fleet all sailed west toward Mexico. The Mexican coast was the one stretch of coastline in that area of the world where they might be safe. Everywhere else was on the lookout for these pirates now, and it was time for them to beat a hasty retreat. Next time, really this time, we return to the West Indies. For the past couple of episodes, we've been recovering old territory to reintroduce some of the players and refresh the story in our memories. Today, though, we're going to pick up on that story where we left off more than a year ago, and we're doing so at a run. First, though, one note. Today's show might seem a bit different than usual. I recently had surgery on one of my hands, which has made typing a difficult, painful, and frustrating nightmare. I'm healing up just fine, but it's made making notes and outlines difficult. Handwriting is also right out. My handwriting is virtually illegible, even at the best of times, and this is not the best of times. So today's episode might be a bit more off the cuff and improvisational than usual. I'll do my best not to swear and to stay on track. But with all that in mind, let's jump right in, and as I said, we're doing so at a run. This is episode 140, Perils and Accidents. When we left off, the pirates had just sacked the city of Guayaquil. They waited around in Guayaquil for a few weeks for a ship called the Catalina that was scheduled to appear and reportedly full of rich cargo. Sadly, though, for the buccaneers there in Guayaquil, according to Ravenel de Luçon, quote, Catalina was returning to the port when, unfortunately for her, she met with Captain David's frigate that sailed much better than she. He could have taken her without making, as he did, 2 days' fight of it, had it not been that the greatest part of his crew, being continually drunk, failed 20 times to come up close to board her. They thought putting up a bloody flag, the Spanish would quickly be brought to strike, but therein they were mistaken. David's people growing sober on the 3rd day, the Spaniards were so terrified that they ran ashore. David's men went to save 2 Spaniards who were swimming, and having escaped the danger of drowning, told them that their captain had had his thigh shot off with a cannonball. End quote. You can see from that quote why I enjoy Ravenel de Luçon so much. In a way, today's going to be an exploration of the many reasons that I feel that way. He's just so much more fun than Dampier or Ringrose is. But not only did Edward Davis show up with the Catalina, which of course denied the ship to the people in Guayaquil, Edward Davis had some bad news to share with the other pirates. I told you last time that the cavalry was on their way, and by cavalry I meant a squadron of elite Biscay mercenary soldiers. David F. Marley writes in Pirates of the Americas, quote, The buccaneers were joined by Davis, who brought in word that a squadron of Peruvian privateers was on its way to drive them off. The Peruvians appeared by May 27, 1687, consisting of the San Jose and San Nicolas of 20 guns apiece, commanded by the Biscayans Dionisio Lopez and Nicolas de Igazara, plus a small patache. End quote. Now you might remember the Biscayans. They were Spanish privateers that were forged in the contentious and difficult Bay of Biscay. That's the bay shared by Spain and France that also sees a lot of Portuguese and English traffic. We're at a time of war between Spain and France, or Portugal and Spain, or Spain and England. It was a dangerous piece of water. And these Biscayans were some of the best privateers in the world. They were hired back in 1685 to augment the Armada de Barlovento in the West Indies. They were hired specifically to counter the rising threat posed by buccaneers like Lauro de Graaf and Michel de Gramont. Now, you might remember the sea battle that was fought between these pirates and this flota of Biscayans as they pulled out of Guayaquil. We spent a whole episode on it a year ago or so we don't need to talk about it here, but it was a contentious fight. However, the pirates escaped mostly unscathed from Guayaquil. But in the wake of that battle, all of the fighting ships that could be raised by Peru were called into action to hunt these pirates down. So when I say we're starting at a run, we're starting on the run. The pirates had to escape. Per Luçon, and there are a lot of quotes today because, as I said, my hand hurts, quote, On the 12th, Captain David's frigate left us, he designing to go and careen at the Isle of Galapagos, that's the Galapagos, and then to sail away for the Strait of Magellan in order to return for the North Sea. As for us, he continues, our vessels were so small, and withal so bad, that it was impossible we should get up higher than the coast of Peru. Neither could they also contain such a quantity of water as we had occasion for. These difficulties made us resolve to return to the western coast, that we might so endeavor to find a way to return to the North Sea overland. We weighed on the 13th, and on the 15th we put ashore in a canoe, where we surprised a watch of 15 Spanish soldiers, who were set upon the side of a curious river. The entertainment we gave them forced them to own unto us that they were to guard the river, which they called El Meralda, because of the many great pieces of emeralds. End quote. And just to be clear, when he says they were bound for the western coast, he means the coast of modern-day Mexico. After a quick jaunt by the pirates to the nearby town of Quito, which they found lightly guarded and unsuspecting, the pirates stocked up on the emeralds they found there. And that reminds me, I should really mention the treasure that they had on board. From this entire voyage, but from Guayaquil in particular. They had a ton of treasure, and everything that they still had with them was the good stuff. They had coined and raw gold and silver. They had gemstones. These emeralds were the most of it, but they had others, and they had pearls in huge quantities. Before moving on, after they took Quito, they split it all up. They divvied their shares out according to the rank and indemnity payments that they had all agreed upon. Every man now knew exactly what his share from this voyage was going to be, which is indicative of something. This voyage was over. I mean, if they came across a ship, sure, they might try and take her, but this was, as far as everyone was concerned, their payment for this entire adventure. Now, they didn't have much in silk or dye or spices. They had traded most of that to Edward Davis. It would be easier for him to carry that larger cargo while they had the more precious small valuables. But then their little fleet got scattered by a squall. Now, this fleet was made up of smaller craft, as he said, like sloops and barks. At this point, Santa Rosa had been scuttled. And the entire fleet lost sight of each other. But a few days later, the sloop that carried Mathurin de Marais and Ravenel de Luçon captured a ship. It was a slave ship, out of Panama, bound for Lima. Now, the men and women they found on board, the now freed slaves, had some news that really interested the pirates. First of all, they had news of a treasure galleon, unfortunately unloaded of all her treasure in Panama, but there being loaded with guns and soldiers. That galleon was being outfitted for the express purpose of hunting down the pirates in the Pacific. De Marais and Luçon certainly, but also all of the other comrades whom were lost. However, these former slaves had another piece of information, that at least one of those other ships had run aground and damaged their ship on an island in Panama Bay. That is what that galleon was going out to attack. These freedmen were free to go, as they pleased, but they elected to sail with the pirates, partly because the pirates could help protect them, and partly because the pirates knew somewhere they could go. And it worked out in the pirates' favor as well, because they knew exactly where their comrades were. The two ships rushed off and arrived in plenty of time to pick up their comrades and escape before the Spanish could get there. But with that, the chase was on. Now, this chase in the Pacific was threefold. First of all, there were the former slaves. As a commodity, not human beings, but as slaves, they were highly valuable to the Spanish, not only in the investment that the Spanish had made back at Port Royal, but in the labor that these slaves were intended to do. The Spanish wanted these slaves back very, very much, and the former slaves obviously wanted to escape that fate. And then there was the Peruvian armada that was sailing in from the east, hot on the pirates' tail, in a bid to recapture all of the treasure that had been stolen, and to, kill the pirates in a horrific public display. And I want to be clear here, the pirates absolutely deserved that. Guayaquil had been a horror show filled with rape and murder and torture and plunder. But then there was this Spanish galleon to the north. Ravenel de Luçon describes this galleon, an Acapulco galleon that might very well have been the very same galleon that Signet had spent so much energy trying and failing to capture. He writes, quote, "When this ship returns from the Philippine Islands, where the Spaniards drive a great traffic, 'tis one of the richest vessels that sails upon the ocean. It's of a prodigious business, and built so strong that she is afraid of nothing but land and fire. She is provided with 40 pieces of cannons. She goes out yearly from the port of Acapulco, convoyed with a patache of 28 guns and laden with pearls, gold dust, and precious stones. The ship had great advantage in making this voyage. That is, that in making choice of a proper season, she goes and returns without being put to the trouble of veering about and sifting the sails. and 'tis beyond dispute that she cannot be met with any that wait for her before the port of Acapulco at a certain season of the year." End quote. And when Luzon says that she cannot be met with before the port of Acapulco, well, it's almost as though he's talking about the Signet, who tried that very thing and was unable to reach her. Luzon continues, quote, "She might, in less than 18 months' time, bating the perils and accidents she might be liable to at sea, return with immense riches." End quote. And Luzon goes on to mention that at least half of the potential strength of the Acapulco galleon was usually out of commission. The ship was so richly laden with the treasures of the Orient that half of her gun decks were below the waterline. But now that all of that treasure was ashore, even despite the extra hands that were on board, all of those ports had operational guns readied for action. Now, the Spanish plan, which probably should have worked, was to cut the pirates off near Panama. That galleon, and her accompanying ships, was going to trap the pirates there near Panama. Even if the Spanish there were unable to take the pirates, that would give the Peruvian armada time to catch up. And that would have happened had the pirates continued on their course. But then they ran into that slave ship, and they chose to take her and free the slaves, and they were warned of the danger. So now that the fleet was back together, Pierre Le Picard and Mathurin de Marais made a change in course. They caught a wind heading southwest that led them deep into the Pacific, but also well out of harm's way. At least, the Spanish were unlikely to find them out there, but they were still at a disadvantage. They needed food and water. Remember, they couldn't hold much on their little vessels. And eventually, they needed to find a landing site at which they could disembark and begin their trek across America. They needed to get back to the mainland. But imagine that, heading leagues and leagues out to sea, and then the leagues and leagues back. That took a lot of time. Meanwhile, the Spanish had patrols up and down the coast, keeping an eye on every potential landing site. I mean, you can see the issue here. Nearly every time the pirates attempted to come ashore to collect water, they found a Spanish man-of-war or a garrison waiting for them. On the one or two occasions that they actually managed to get ashore, they usually had to effect a hasty retreat when the Spanish arrived on the scene. And once or twice they had to fight their way free from that. And the Spanish could have chased after the pirates, but why bother? Their strategy of patrolling the coast and guarding the ports was working so well. And in those fights for escape, a few pirates were killed. A few others died of natural causes out on the sea. However, these pirates made a specific point of burying their dead on land rather than at sea. It was important to them. But Luzon tells us, quote, "The Spaniards believe themselves revenged when they cut into pieces or burn the dead body of an enemy. We were assured that when we buried any of our men in their country, they dig them up when we were gone, for to exercise cruelty upon those carcasses which, when alive, they could not make us feel." End quote. Now, at first glance, I'm tempted to just brush that aside as propagandistic nonsense. I mean, Sulla might disinter Marius and dump him in the river, the Soviets might hide Hitler's bones, and we might dump bin Laden in the sea, but that serves a purpose. That denies your enemies a place to pay homage. But who was out here to pay homage to a few ragged pirates? Why would they bother doing that? But then I think about the religious angle. The Spanish were a deeply religious Catholic culture, and that might explain something of this behavior. I mean, in their view, the heretic Protestants weren't going to be going to heaven. But what about the French? Most of whom, even the pirates at this point, were Catholic. Not necessarily devout or even really practicing Catholics, but Catholic nonetheless. The Spanish may have been denying these Catholics a proper burial, and thus denying them entry into heaven. Now, that's not a belief held by the modern church, but 17th century theocratic monarchies had much more severe belief systems. Or, then again, Luzon could just be lying. It could be propaganda. Regardless, though, the pirates were having real trouble for weeks and weeks all along the coasts of Panama and Costa Rica. Luzon writes of Costa Rica, quote, "From this port to Acapulco we have no harbor. This country upon the South Sea is best peopled with several very rich towns. More gold mines are found there than in Peru, and are more valued than the mines of Tosi. Therefore it is not without reason that this coast is called Costa Rica. On the 7th of December, 1687, we went to make a descent upon a town called Muemoluna. We found a very strong entrenchment made upon a rock that stands upon the river. But the Spaniards therein made no great resistance, no more than in the town where we completed our victualling. The prisoners we took told us that about a month before they had seen a frigate pass by." End quote. What he's saying is that they found a town that did have an entrenchment, a small fortification, but no major ships and no big guns, so they were able to take the town and learn that just a few weeks earlier a frigate had passed by their way. That gave the pirates, for the first time, a slight advantage. They had some knowledge of Spanish movements in the region. Specifically here, they knew that at least one flota was currently to the east, toward Panama, opposite their destination. This was good news, at least potentially. The pirates might now have a place to go ashore and to cross over to the Caribbean. They might have it here in Costa Rica, not originally as planned in Mexico. Now, it might still be impossible to do so here, and the captains were prudently cautious about this. If they invested everything into crossing here, they might never make it. There were a number of potential dangers, but one stood out above all. In the surrounding countryside here in Costa Rica, there was a cavalry unit that, at least Luzon tells us, numbered up to maybe 6,000 men. At this point, this cavalry could be 100 or 200 leagues away, or they could be just over the next rise. The pirates had no idea. Perhaps even more dangerous, the cavalry could and probably was split up into smaller groups of 100 or 200 men dotting the land and keeping an eye on every potential landing point. Without any good intelligence on this, the pirates could be ambushed at any moment. More concerning than an ambush even was the possibility of losing their ships. If they invested everything into a crossing here in Costa Rica, the Spanish might show up and destroy their ships, at which point they would be forced to cross, and then they might just run into the cavalry. However, if they had their canoes and their sloops and their barks, they still had a line of retreat. They still had somewhere to run. If their ships were taken, everything was lost. So Desmarais gave permission to 18 men to stay ashore and to do some reconnaissance. Luckily for us, Ravenot de Luzon was among the 18. He writes, quote, "The greatest part of our men were not content to pass by land to the North Sea, because of the 5,000 or 6,000 men wherewith we were threatened. Wherefore we left those that were minded to return to the canoes, and 18 of us, who found ourselves less weary than the rest, stayed behind. We followed a great road which we met with soon after they had left us, and had not walked above an hour when we took 3 horsemen, whom, when we had asked where we were, they told us that about a quarter of a league off there was a town called Chiloteca. We had a mind to run after our men, to acquaint them with this account, and engage them to go back with us to the town. But the apprehensions we were under of being discovered, and thereby giving the inhabitants time to put themselves into a posture of defense, hindered us to do so, and made us undertake the boldest, most resolute, and the rashest action that could be thought of, to adventurously enter the town, where we surprised and frightened the Spaniards. We took the officers and 50 persons, including the women, prisoner." End quote. I mean, that's a movie, right? The boldest, most resolute, and rashest action. 18 intrepid pirates take a small town in Central America. They surprised and frightened the Spaniards and took 50 persons, including the women, prisoner. Coming soon on Netflix. And of course, in a pirate movie, you need to begin on a ship at sea, but you move on to this second act very quickly. It's almost a Western, right? The Dirty 18. Now, the pirates had taken the church in the center of town, along with all of their prisoners, and that's great, but there's still a bunch of people out there with guns and swords. What's more, the prisoners that they had in the church had some bad news for them. Some of that cavalry that the pirates so feared, 600 of them, were expected back in town at any moment. That bold, resolute, and rash action turned out to be kind of a bad idea. And that's how you end the second act, right? The pirates are at their darkest point and death is at the door. The only real advantages that these 18 pirates had were the church itself, which was relatively defensible, and the Spanish lack of knowledge about their numbers. The people would have assumed that there were far more pirates in the church. Those 18 pirates blew into town and took prisoners so quickly that they scared off nearly all the people. Lussan writes, quote, "They were seized with such a panic, supposing us to be far more numerous than we were, that all the rest would doubtless have been taken and bound by us, had it not been for their horses, which they mounted to ride away upon." End quote. And then the pirates did something incredibly stupid. They left a few behind to guard the prisoners, but most of them went out to scour the town for valuables. But then the people returned. Quote, "The Spaniards, who were a little recovered of their astonishment, entered into the town again, and after we several times conflicted with them, we entrenched ourselves in the church, where we had put our prisoners, who believed their people pursued us close, which made them, the people in the church, so bold as to run to the swords and other arms we had, wherewith they wounded one man. We got to the doors and fired upon them till there were no more than 4 men and their wives left alive." End quote. So the pirates, surprised by the return of the people that lived there in town, fought several small skirmishes, eventually making it back to the church and, looking out, trying to see if anybody was after them, those people in the church grabbed weapons and attacked them. Then the pirates were forced to hold the door and fire both inside and outside of the church. It doesn't get much more exciting than that. But then it gets dark. The pirates killed all but 8 prisoners, 42 or more. 4 men and 4 women were left alive. So the pirates grabbed their guns and their swords and climbed over the pile of corpses they had just created and took those 8 prisoners quietly out the back door, where they climbed on some stolen horses and rode out of town. And that's basically the end of a Western. I mean, Costa Rica is a lot more lush than the American West, but a posse of black hats making a final stand in a Spanish church in Central America, then stealing horses to ride off into the sunset, I mean, that's a Zorro movie. And the pirates, again, were definitely the black hats. Quote, "We mounted the horses, and with our 4 prisoners of each sex, went away with as little noise as we could. The Spaniards sent one to treat with us, but we refused and fired upon him, for fear if he came too near, he should know how few we were." End quote. If this were a spaghetti western, with our intrepid band of anti-heroes, or perhaps our ragged group of outlaws, if it were a spaghetti western, this is where to end it, riding off into the sunset. And I think that is where we're going to leave it today. At the end of what appeared to be a last stand. But it wasn't the last stand for these pirates. They had several more last stands to come before they would reach safety. Next time, we're going to discuss the final days of these pirates in the Pacific. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, all of our patrons on Patreon, everybody who has recommended this show to your friends or your family, and everybody who has given us a like or a rating or a review. All of you make this possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you can do so at brillig.com.au. That's BRILLIG.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.